Today on the Videomaker podcast, Chris and I talked to Drew Geraci. Drew is a filmmaker. He's the director of photography and owner of District 7 Media. He's a world-class time-lapse cinematographer, Sony Artisan of Imagery, and a brand partner at Dell. You've probably seen his work on the show House of Cards and also Steven Spielberg's new rendition of West Side Story. Drew knows a ton about time-lapse. He is basically like the industry leader here. And we learned a lot while talking to Drew about time-lapse. And he shares with us his challenges and kind of the headaches that he has to go through as a time-lapse filmmaker, but also gives us a little bit of history about where time-lapse started, at least when he started, and kind of where it is today and where it might be going. And he's just a wealth of knowledge, and I'm sure you're going to learn a lot. As always, if you've been listening to the podcast and you enjoy it, we'd love it if you went to Spotify or iTunes or your favorite podcast app of choice and followed or subscribed to the podcast. It's really helpful for you. It'll download the podcast straight to your mobile device whenever we release it, and it's a big help for us as well. So with all that out of the way, let's get on to our conversation with Drew Geraci. Welcome to the Videomaker podcast. I'm Mike Wilhelm, and with me, as always, is Chris Monlux.
Hello.
And special guest today, Drew Geraci. Drew, how's it going?
It's going well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So let's see. Actually, before we get started with getting into the details of your work, maybe you could just sort of give us the brief history of Drew. How did you get started in the video and filmmaking world?
The $2 history of Drew. That's a great question. So, actually, I started off. I was in the military as a combat journalist out there, mass communication specialist, deployed all over the place. And I really had an affinity for photo and video. Did that for about 10 years, and then decided to break off from that and go into the public realm. And I did journalism for a while, and it's really boring. Not my thing. Not my cup of tea. And I decided to start my own business, which is District 7 Media. And I should back up just a little bit. But before I did that, I actually started getting into time-lapse, motion-controlled time-lapse, robotics, and aerial. This is all back in 2010, 2011, before it really took off. And that's kind of where I discovered my niche of being a time-lapse photographer, because there's not a lot out there. And I was like, hey, maybe I can do this full-time. And that's when I created District 7 Media. And we do obviously more things than just time-lapse, but it's something that I'm known for. And it's one of those things that I really like doing. In fact, I do it pretty much daily, and it's really fun to do. But really, we're getting into a much larger spectrum now and of things that we're offering services-wise. And our clientele are just going through the roof. I mean, when I first started doing this, I worked on just a few little shows here and there, and then it blossomed into something much larger, obviously, getting to work with David Fincher for Netflix's House of Cards, and then most recently working with Steven Spielberg on West Side Story. So it's just exponentially grown year after year, and I'm really, really excited. I don't know how I got so lucky to be where I'm at, but it's one of those things that kind of have to pinch yourself because you're like, this is my life, this is what I'm doing, and it's really fun.
So, when you left the military and you decided journalism wasn't for you, there's still dozens or maybe hundreds of other paths you could have taken. So, why time-lapse?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I always enjoy telling stories, and I enjoy the medium of cinematography and video and whatnot. But time-lapse for me is one of those things where you get to really, take in the area that you're shooting. So, rather than just being out in a specific location for maybe a couple hours, just filming and whatnot, you're out there for multiple hours or maybe days, just capturing the essence of what that location is. And it really allows you to have, in my mind, like an inner piece almost, where you get to see things that aren't happening naturally to the naked eye, and you have to speed those up to actually see what comes of it. And I really like that. And I think there's just something about it that just sparks my interest. And there's always new, fun, and creative ways to come up with new ways to shoot time lapse. So I'm always trying to find those. We just recently, not recently, last couple of years ago, started doing microscope time lapses. Watching little microbes move around and whatnot. I always thought that was interesting. And most recently, working with Sony with their Sony AirPeak and doing more hyperlapses from the drone. And that's something I think is the next big thing. And then 360 VR stuff. And, there seems like there's like an endless possibility for time lapse, which is why I'm doing it.
So Drew, so I think everybody that's done time lapse understands that it doesn't always turn out. When you first start out, I think the percentage of failed time lapses is higher. I would love to hear, your experience early on, starting out doing time lapse, and then contrasting that with, kind of success rate of your projects today.
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. So thanks for that. There's so many failures with this just because you have so many different variables when it comes to time lapse. You can have a change in light exposure. You can have birds, people, or even just some occasions, people will actually come by and like literally touch your camera, move a tripod leg, and you're just like, what the hell are you thinking? And there's just so many different variables when it comes to time lapse. And that's the one thing that I don't think a lot of people realize is once one thing bad happens in that time lapse, it could just be the smallest nudge of the tripod, but you've lost the entire shot and you've got to restart, go back over and keep doing it. And it's really just a big pain in the ass. So the things that I've learned along the way is, always making sure that the area is clear of people. I rope off the areas now. Bring a ton of sandbags. The more stabilization and sturdiness that you have, the better. Because ultimately, any kind of vibration you have to your camera is going to be shown in post, and you don't want that. So I definitely strive for perfection. I have failed my fair share of time lapses. I even fail them now. But that's because there's just so many different things that can happen. But I think the great thing about it, though, is that technology has advanced so far in the past 10 years that it's really made it easier for people to go out there and do time lapses. I'll just say, for instance, doing like day to night time lapses in the past were pretty much one of the most difficult things to do. Like you would have to manually stop down your camera, shutter speed, ISO by itself, making sure not to touch the camera. And like, it was just like this pins and needles sort of thing. And you could have software like a little bramper, what they call them. So it could do a little ball bramping here and there. And that worked, but it wasn't always guaranteed. And you could spend probably 14 to 20 hours creating a shot. And then, you mess up one time in that little sequence of events and you've trashed your entire day. So it's really unfortunate. But now, cameras today are just ridiculous where you can like set it on to aperture priority. You can actually have it ramp the ISO, ramp that shutter speed using new software. And it looks absolutely beautiful. I think in some cases it takes away from, the ability of, the photographer and cinematographer to do it and gives it more out to like the public space where anybody can do it. But at the same time, it just means that there's more creative things that you can do with it. And that's what I love.
Yeah, I remember the first time lapse I did, which was probably around 2010 or something, that you needed an intervalometer. You needed a second piece of hardware to even just tell the camera to take a picture in an interval. And now that's all like, not only is it built into your camera, but they'll give you a night to day or day to night or clouds mode or all sorts of things that really take away that trepidation of like, what's the beginning settings I need to adjust to what I'm shooting. I imagine you've done time lapses that have spanned days, weeks, months, years. What's the longest time lapse that you've experienced up to this point?
So that's a great question. So I worked on a project. I can't tell you who the client is for. Very large client, but the project never actually got taken off. But it was about 1.5 years worth of work, and it went down the tube because somebody else did something else in the production, and this will never see the light of day. And I wish I could tell you what it was, but it was really beautiful and very fruity. Some might say, a bite out of an apple, but it was really good. And it was probably the longest shot that I've done. And it's unfortunate because no one will see it. But, on the more like cinematic side stuff, we've been working with a bunch of different production companies. We just wrapped up a feature out in Canada just this past October. And we set up a time-lapse shot on motion control for about 20 days. And it was probably one of the coolest shots I've ever done, especially using motion control, because we had a little tent set up out there, a little generator. If any of the components ever lost power, we had like a 10-minute window to swap batteries and swap power. So it's one of those challenges when you're doing long-term time lapses. How do you get it to be powered? How do you make sure that it's weatherproof? And when you're using motion control, it's so difficult to do. And thankfully, we lucked out. There was only one bad day of weather, but the ending shot looks phenomenal. So when the movie comes out next year, or actually this year maybe, it's called Dark Harvest. You guys definitely have to check it out.
Awesome. That's exciting. I always feel the joy after you get done with that time lapse. You're like, okay, I think I got all the settings right. I think I had the duration. I have my shot hopefully is long enough for what I need. And then you get into the computer, you start and you get to see it in sequence, and it's like, oh yeah, I'm amazing. You start to feel like God. I feel like, it's like,
right,
man,
exactly.
This is, who else could do this? I'm amazing. But then you could just as well with the swath that had the next one you look at and you screwed it up and you're like, I'm horrible.
Dude, I'll tell you what, there was one instance where I was on a project and the shot was so beautiful. Everything was lined up perfectly. I was like, I nailed this. This is going to be the best fucking shot I've ever shot. And I left the freaking autofocus on. And the entire time that the time lapse is shooting, the autofocus is going back and forth on the damn camera. And it just ruined the entire shot. And those are those small little details that if you forget to do it even once, it can totally jeopardize the entire shoot. You have to go back and reshoot it. So that's why I'm always in the mindset of like, always make sure everything's on manual. Auto, anything just destroys your shot. But there are obviously instances where you can use auto, but especially on focus, forget about it. It's got to be a manual focus lens.
So in some cases, I imagine you know when it's going to be screwed up, like in the middle of the shoot, right? If someone trips over the tripod, for example. In other cases, you don't know until you're looking at it in post. But regardless, these things come up and they're a surprise. If you have, if you know you have to get a shot that is going to take 14 hours or in some cases, I guess many days, what are you planning in terms of your schedule, right? Like if it's a 14-hour shoot, are you planning like a week to get this shot or what's your approach there?
Yeah, for the most of the time, the long-term stuff, I always buffer in at least 2 extra days of filming because there's always weather issues and there's always logistics issues. But I'm always going through my checklist. I have this full checklist of things, make sure that the intervalometer is set correctly, make sure that all of the auto features are turned off, make sure that, I go out there and do a sun survey. I want to make sure I'm getting the right light, hitting the location at the time that the client wants it. I have to make sure that if we're using motion control, that everything is timed up correctly to that event. And there's just so much involved in the planning process that you really have to take a couple of days just on the forefront to make sure that you get the shot. And then I will say half the time, and this is like the most bullshit thing about time lapse, is like, it's super easy to set up and whatnot. I could spend almost 2 or 3 hours just trying to set up the camera in that right position where it's there. But, sometimes like the weather changes instantly and then like the producer's like, oh, no, go over there and go shoot over there. And you're just like, well, we haven't even set up for over there. We haven't even planned anything for that. And you just kind of have to be on your toes and always being able to change it when those variables happen. It's funny because there's so many people that come out with me and when I have a time-lapse job and they're like, oh, you just press a button. It's really simple. And I'm like, no, there's a lot of variables involved. It's just not pressing a button, but I like where you're going. So, it's always an interesting feat trying to come out and plan shots. But for the most part, long-term time-lapse isn't terrible, but you definitely have to go in with the game plan beforehand. So
when you started 10 years ago or so, the process of getting time-lapse must have been much more complicated. Like Chris was talking about, you need the intervalometer. I would imagine the motion control systems at the time required a lot more tinkering than they do now. Especially that was especially true with drone cinematography at the time.
Oh yeah.
And over time the technology improves. But where do you think it's going, right? Like, do you think you're going to get to a point where there's really no tinkering involved anymore? Or is that always going to be a part of the process?
Yeah, it's funny. I always get asked this question because everyone always tells me, oh, time-lapse is just a fad. It's going to go away. And, there's not going to be a use for it in the future, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, that's just not true. But as far as the technology goes, I think we're at the kind of the summit of where we can go from the technology standpoint, other than just having it programmed automatically to then do the ramping that you want, where you can just type in and configure the parameters on your iPad or tablet and just put it into the camera and then it does it all, which would be great. But I think we're going to see larger sensors coming out with higher noise sensitivity. They're going to reveal much greater things. I can't wait till, we can go out there and shoot the Milky Way almost in a 1-to-1 kind of ratio of light, where you could have that ISO jacked up to 1 million. So you can see the beautiful Milky Way, but there's no noise in the camera, which would just make for, the perfect time lapse and backdrop. But, as technology evolves, especially with lenses, we're getting faster lenses, especially from Sony. Getting like 1.4, 1.2 lenses. and the sharpness and the quality and the lightness of the lens itself are just amazing. And it really allows you to go out there and, do backpacking where you can bring 3 or 4 cameras and lenses as well, instead of just having one camera. And the biggest thing for us, at least, is how, you can transport these cameras and get like cinema quality out of them with, just the fact that they're like £1.50 pounds, if that. And back in the day when we were shooting with like the Canon 5D Mark IIs and Mark IIIs and whatnot, those bad boys were like a good solid 5 or 6 pounds with the lens kit and everything that onto it. And it really takes a toll when you're out there hiking. But now it's, the technology has evolved to the point where, you can go out there with, a robust set of tools and you're not breaking your back. But I think the future for us holds quite a lot for time lapse. I don't see it like slowing down at any point, just because so many films and TV, time lapse is now, it's a necessity and everybody uses it. And it's something that will be one of those things that I think will last for, another solid 20 or 30 years before everyone's like, okay, stop time lapsing. We don't want any more time lapses. But for the foreseeable future, I think it's one of those things that it's definitely needed for a lot of productions. And it's great too. It's great eye candy. So you're doing TikTok videos or short reels. Everybody loves to see stuff, happen in a short period of time, but sped up. So it's pretty interesting.
And what do you think about the kind of the future of the robotic side of things, right? Like in the last 10 years, drone technology has come quite a ways in the sense that you don't have to build your own drones anymore. And you almost don't have to pilot your own drones anymore, right? In some cases.
That's true.
But motion control.
Especially with drone technology, there's a lot of great stuff that's coming out. And I think we will see a lot more automation as far as, where we can fly. But we also have to take a look at the restrictions that we have right now from the FAA. And there's quite a few of them out there. So it'll be a balance between technology and I think policymakers in Washington to figure out exactly how we can dictate that. Because you take a look at what Amazon's trying to do with their mobile drone service and whatnot. I mean, there's a lot of caveats that are applied to that. So I don't know how they would operate in airspace around DC, just because pretty much everything in a 50-mile radius is blocked off. But as far as technology goes, I mean, it's sky is the limits, literally. With these drones, and there's so much potential for time lapse, for video, 360, everything with them, and I'm really excited about that.
And ground-based motion control has not progressed at quite the same rate, I guess, but I guess maybe at some point you might get super intelligent track systems or something. Yeah,
I think that we're kind of caught in an era with the motors and the size of the tracks, because everything is based on weight. And I think as cameras get smaller and lighter, then we can obviously come down for smaller and lighter motion control systems. But at the same time, if you're trying to work out a scene with an Alexa or a Red or something, Sony Venice that's just massive, we're talking like 20, 30, 40 pounds. It's really difficult to come up with more modular designs for motion control. But, we work with Kessler quite a bit, and I love what they're doing with the Cine shooter. It's got like a 20-pound payload to it. So I can put the entire weight of my camera, if I can put a cinema lens on there with a matte box, and you still get really beautiful motion control shots for a package that probably weighs like 20 or 30 pounds in total. But what I really want to see, and this is what I want, it's a little damn tabletop robotic arm that they use for high speed, like the Bolt Junior or whatever, but like a miniature Bolt Junior, where you could just put it on the tabletop and then the camera just whizzes around with like a small DSLR and a small lens. And that's what I want to see. And I don't think, to my knowledge, anyone's come up with anything like that yet, but hopefully they do so.
It seems like the technology as far as size goes that they could put it all there, but I think it's more of the demand. How you gotta be able to sell enough to make it worthwhile, right?
So,
and I mean, motors aren't cheap.
Yeah.
So, Drew, I think we've all had this experience where we're self-taught in a certain discipline. And sometimes when you're self-taught, it takes you a while to learn some of the things that if someone just told it to you outright, it's not exactly a difficult concept. It just takes a while to discover it through this discovery process. So what is there in the time-lapse world, if there is something here, where it's actually kind of a simple concept or a simple technique that took you too long to learn, that if someone was starting out, you could just say, hey, by the way, this is a thing that you should learn quickly?
Yeah. I mean, quite right off the bat, the easiest thing that, you can take it from, 0 to 100 really quick is just by using long exposures. And it's what we call dragging the shutter. When I first started out, I was shooting everything at like 1/60th, like one over like 500th of a second, like really fast shutter speeds. And that's absolutely the most wrong thing you could ever do in a time lapse, because just like shooting cinema, you want to keep that 180-degree rule. And if you want to shoot at 1/30th and below, that's the best. And when you shoot about a half a second to a full second, that's when you get that really beautiful cinematic kind of quality, where you get that nice subtle motion blur from whatever objects are in the scene. And it really comes across as being very epic and very cinematic. And when you shoot it above shutter speeds that are higher than that, it just looks choppy and, I don't know, like unprofessional. So that's the biggest thing that I learned was that in general. And so if you are shooting time lapse, just slap on some ND filters, drag the shutter, to be good to go.
You know, it reminds me of like probably a lot of people's first experience doing time lapses with a really small sensor camera or like a GoPro or something that has a time lapse mode.
Right.
And those are like little ants running around. There's no motion blur. All it is just taking a sample. And so there's really nothing special other than sped up time. You might as well just shoot video for 3 hours and speed it up. So right. that makes a big difference in contrast to what you're talking about, the long exposure things, because we experience a lot of motion blur just with our own eyes. That is pleasant and expected, and it's weird when it's not there. I totally get that the cinematic shots are going to come from those that actually have that in the shot, the motion blur, just because I think we're so used to seeing it with our eyes, right?
Right. Exactly.
So, Drew, are you in the world of time lapse? Are you mostly self-taught, or did you have someone teach you how to do that? I mean, this is the time lapse is, I don't want to say a new thing, but it certainly has become more mainstream over the last 10 years.
Yeah, I mean, time lapse definitely isn't new. It's been around, for decades. I mean, you can go back to like the 50s and 60s and see plenty of time lapses being used. And back then, they were shooting on film, but I think with the advent of digital technology and the ability to go into post-production with digital, time-lapse has been made much, much easier. For me personally, there's always that challenge of, how do you start a project and how do you finish a project, but then also, how do you process that project? And I don't think a lot of people think about the processing that's involved with time-lapse photography. I mean, just when we first started, the process of time-lapse photography, it took us days to render out one shot. And I think that's probably what, set me apart at the time, because I had just started developing time lapse. And obviously I've been self-taught the whole process. And but what I really wanted to learn about wasn't necessarily time lapse photography, but it was about HDR time lapse photography. And that's kind of what set me off in the whole time lapse realm before, because I wanted to see if somebody could do that. And I remember back in about 2007, 2008, all of these people were doing HDR type, still photos. And I thought they looked really cool. Obviously now we know that it looks like shit. It's awful. But when you're talking about having to bracket 3 photos together, merge those 3 photos, but then do that in a batch process, we were talking about, maybe 5,000 or 6,000 photos for one 20-second sequence. It was such a pain in the ass to do, but it's all self-taught. I just wanted to go out there and figure out how to do that. I learned to use a program back then called Photomatics, and that was great. And then we I was actually talking with developers from Adobe, because Lightroom hadn't had a batch process on how to actually export multiple photos at the same time. They subsequently added that like maybe a year after we started talking, which was great. And it's all those little things that you have to kind of teach yourself along the way. Be like, well, how do I get this into this quadrant here, and how do I make it so that it comes out over here the right way? Because you're taking 3 different photos and then merging it down into one photo. Then you've got to process that one photo into the actual time lapse. And like I had said before, the render times on it were horrendous. I mean, we were waiting days just to get 20 seconds worth of footage out, because we were using like dual core processors with like 1 gigabyte of video memory. And at the time, like, this is cutting edge. And then it really wasn't. But I mean, it's so bad. But I mean, thankfully, because of today's technology, I can like slap down, 8K, 10K, 12K footage, play it back real time, raw, and process it all right out in probably a matter of minutes. And it's just so amazing. But going back to your original question, for time lapse in general, I was always inspired by a few folks. I don't necessarily want to say their names because I don't necessarily that's the right word. Never mind. Let's scratch that. But I've been inspired by folks in the past, and getting into the time-lapse world was really good. Well, but the community back in the early 2010s was really awesome. It was a really close-knit group of friends that really came together to kind of like work out the kinks, like, oh, how do we achieve this? How do we do that? And that was great for about 6 or 7 years. And then I think since then that has kind of dissolved the community, just because time-lapse is so readily and easily available to everybody that, there's just like no real reason to talk about it anymore. But there's always a continual need to learn more, keep pushing the envelope for time-lapse and try to find new ways to showcase it off to people and how to use it in different productions. So,
you're talking about how long it takes to just see if the work is, as a cohesive whole, make a video out of all the stills. And it reminds me of like when I first started editing that, like, you can do real-time fades, right? You couldn't fade between two shots and actually see that fade. And how like now I might put, 100 fades in something. I wouldn't actually, but I might do, a lot of effects that I wouldn't ever have thought to even apply because I couldn't even get to the point of observing what they did. Whereas now we might just continue to pile on until the computer starts to slow down. And it's amazing how that ability to just preview what you did and learn from it quicker will help you get better a lot faster, right? It doesn't take 2 days to realize you made a mistake. You can come back, see it, and go, oh man, maybe I'll get tonight's sunset instead of last night's or whatever. You can actually react to it instead of being like 3 days later, I put all this energy into it and it's bad. It always reminds me of like any kind of production when it's in the finishing stages. If the finisher, what they do will destroy all of the work that everybody else did. It's just such a sad situation. And it's like, if you have to wait to see if that thing didn't actually work out, so you can start all over, is a really big, a big thing of growth for all those that are involved in it. Now you're talking about doing HDR time lapse. Now that's really what you started with, what got you into House of Cards, doing the opening for that, right? And that's what that challenge there. And it's funny watching it now and you're like, oh, it's time lapse. You would think this is not, but thinking of the time it was like, that was doing a in-camera bracketed HDR shot wasn't even necessarily easy, let alone making compositing those in, from separate time lapses or doing brackets and making it so the weather still looks right. Clouds move fast, right? So how do you take 3 images of them and make sure that they all, have a high dynamic range?
Yeah. That's actually the funny part about shooting HDR for that particular one is because we had to come up with a way that we could get one shot that had motion blur and that the other 2 shots didn't have motion blur, so that when you compiled them together, it just kind of had that hint of motion blur to it. Otherwise, if you did all 3 with motion blur, it just looked absolutely awful because the lines wouldn't match up and you get all this ghosting effect. And there's like a learning phase out there. And we were working with some really fun folks over at Rock, Paper, Scissors, Angus Wall's company. If you don't know who Angus Wall is, he did like the opening sequence for Fight Club, the editor for Fight Club as well, and really came up with some really cool, amazing stuff. But like, we got to work with him and his team and kind of came up with ways to, kind of create the process as it was evolving because nobody else had been doing it. So it was a really fun learning experience.
Now, fast forward that to now, which you're now working with Spielberg doing stuff. Tell us how about, as much as I haven't seen the original West Side Story, and I don't know if I'll see this one either, but it's still a Spielberg film and surely a really important one. What was that?
It's really good, man. You have to go see it.
I bet it is. Maybe not be my kind of drama, but regardless.
Chris doesn't like music.
I don't like music. Yeah, music's horrible. It's more of the love stories. I'm bah humbug when it comes to love. No, I don't know what I'm talking about.
I can see that.
So what was the experience? So the time lapse you did for it is for the end credits, and it's really moody shots of New York. Am I right? I haven't actually seen it.
Yeah, I mean, I could share it with you here. Actually, well, I guess I can't. So what we did was we did a collection of time-lapse shots that were basically showcasing different areas of New York City and New Jersey, but it's all using shadow and light. So you have like the Chrysler building as it like swipes up on the as the shadows sweep up the side of another building. So you kind of get that nice vignette of the look at the Chrysler building and whatnot. And you also have all these different other, like, it's hard to explain if you haven't seen it, but it's really just like beautiful 1950s architecture with light just cascading across it. And then the titles are revealed as the shadows pass by. And it was a really cool experience. It initially started off just as a light test because, Spielberg called up and was like, oh, hey, come out to the set tomorrow. And I was like, okay, let's do this. And then we get out there and they're like, yeah, we just want to do some lighting tests and you got to sit down and talk with him, show him some of the stuff that he wants to do. And then he's like, yeah, looks great. Just go out there and shoot whatever you want. And just make it look cool. I was like, all right, cool, let's do that. And we ended up shooting it for the first day. And then I sent the dailies back to the production manager. She was looking at it. He was looking at it like, okay, these look pretty cool. Why don't you shoot that a couple more days? We'll see what happens. I wasn't even expecting anything to come out of it, creating the title sequence for it or shooting for it, I should say. And about maybe 2 months later, I got a call and they're like, hey, can you come up to New York for like a month or two and start doing some more shots because they want to use this for like the full title sequence. And I was like, okay, let's make it happen. And it was just one of those one-off chances that I had the availability to do it. And it was really cool because as we're coming through and shooting all of the shots, Stephen was out there actually editing it back in his office and coming back with like critiques and whatnot and working with the art director that was out there. He's amazing, Adam Stockhouse. We were just like, hey, let's get an angle over here. Let's get an angle over here and let's do this. And it really worked out really well. And I'm really excited for the way the product turned out.
Hello? Oh,
we lost our internet connection. And that's about where the internet gods decided it's time to end the podcast. So we will have Drew back in a few months. Probably Drew's a very busy guy, but there are a few more topics we wanted to discuss. So we'll get to those next time, including the Sony Airpeak, which very few people have had a chance to fly, and also what it's like to run a business and start a business as a time-lapse cinematographer. So thank you, Drew, for joining us this time. Hopefully we can have an uninterrupted podcast next time. As always, if you've been listening to the podcast and you enjoy it, we'd love it if you went to iTunes and gave us a 5-star review and a written review at that. It's always fun to read those. So for Chris Monlux and everyone here at Videomaker, I've been Mike Wilhelm, and you've been listening to the Videomaker podcast. We'll catch you next time.